A special welcome to our international participants, particularly our keynote speakers. My name is Roman Zawiski, and I am the team member of the organizing committee of this conference. Today we will have two working languages, English and Ukrainian. I will speak for the English audience, and a colleague of mine, Roman Solovey, please raise your hand. Roman Solovey will speak in Ukrainian for the Ukrainians. Roman, please.
Yes. Шановні колеги, ми раді вітати вас на відкритті Міжнародної наукової конференції «Релігія і наука від протистояння до взаємодоповнення». Конференція спрямована на те, аби стимулювати конструктивний діалог та взаємодію між релігійними і науковими традиціями, які часто в нашому дискурсі постають як взаємосуперечливі. Ми хотіли б, щоб молоді науковці та досвідчені вчені з провідних наукових центрів та богословських установ отримали можливість познайомитись з роботою своїх колег в академічному контексті. Конференція, як ми про це писали, розпочинає великий проект, спрямований на пошук нових стратегій для досягнення взаєморозуміння між релігією та наукою через низку заходів на різних рівнях, в яких братимуть участь науковці, академічні теологи та філософи з трьох основних гілок християнства в Україні. Реалізація проекту також сприятиме обміну інформацією у галузі науки і релігії, розвитку співпраці та творенню освітньої платформи для гармонізації релігійного і наукового світоглядів в українському контексті. І зараз я передаю слово Роману Завійському.
This project, this conference today inaugurates a bigger project that is called Religion and Science, Capacity Building for the Future. It is supported by the John Templeton Foundation. It is part of the New Horizons for Science and Religion in Central and Eastern Europe, and it is done in collaboration with the Ian Ramsey Center for Science and Religion at the University of Oxford, of which our first speaker today, Professor Alistair McGrath, is the director. The objectives of this project, Religion and Science, Capacity Building for the Future, is a contribution to knowledge sharing, supporting communication and dissemination of information in the field of science and religion, as well as facilitating domestic cooperation network and platform for collecting, processing, and sharing information and conducting informational campaigns, trainings, and educational activities, causing attitude change of different kinds of stakeholders and a general public. The legacy of communist atheism in Ukraine resulted in lacunas within intellectual tradition of faith-based communities, not only Latin and Byzantine Rite Catholic, but also Orthodox and Protestant, when it comes to the faith and reason, religion and science. Religion as such was ridiculed in light of science. Nowadays, the so-called new atheism find its way into minds of younger generation of Ukrainians through the media. One of the most common stereotypes in that is that science and religion are essentially incompatible. For people today, whether religious or not, new realities brought on by the rapid development of technology, artificial intelligence, and robotization challenge the basic values we hold as human beings, sometimes even influences how we use technology in ways that are either helpful or harmful. Despite the revival of theology in Ukraine, intellectual communities, public universities feel the lack of compelling books and courses that could help to bring religious issues into public debates of the present-day Ukraine from a global perspective. Moreover, no translations of very common foreign guides on science and religion have been done. At the same time, because of the complicated historical, social, and political situation in Ukraine, the level of interest in the present issues, both national, international, including the intersection of science and religion, constantly increases. So this project aims at sharing knowledge, developing new strategies of attaining an encounter, mutual understanding, and a fruitful dialogue between religion and science through an array of activities in numerous cities across Ukraine on different levels: universities, seminaries, secondary schools, public sector, web platforms, media, and social networks, and will be involving scientists, academic theologians, and philosophers from three major traditions of Christianity in Ukraine: Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant. So please, Roman.
Yes, thank you, Роман. Шановні колеги, як ми вже і казали, ця конференція є частиною ширшого проекту «Релігія і наука. Від протистояння до взаємодоповнення». Цей проект здійснюється за підтримки фундації Джона Темплтона в рамках проекту «Нові горизонти для науки і релігії» у Центрально-Східній Європі у співпраці Східноєвропейського інституту теології з Центром Оксфордського університету Іана Рамсі з досліджень науки і релігії. І, як ми вже також згадували сьогодні в англомовному представленні, цю конференцію організовувала ціла група інституційних партнерів, це, зокрема, Східноєвропейський інститут теології, Українська філія Європейського товариства католицького богослов'я, Івано-Франківська академія Івана Золотоустого, Товариство європейських євангельських теологів і Львівський національний медичний університет імені Данила Галицького. Будь ласка, Романе.
The purpose of today's conference is to initiate a more constructive dialogue between Christian theological and secular scientific worldviews to analyze and overcome mutual stereotypes and to move forward towards the sustainable cooperation and exchange of ideas. It is our aim that young academics, and today we have with us a lot of graduate students, PhD students within the field of intersection of science and religion, as well as the senior scholars, and whether from the leading centers of science or from theological institutions, and they will have a chance to respond to their colleagues' work in a professional and academic settings. Please, Roman.
І також я хотів би зараз представити нашого основного доповідача на сьогоднішній нашій першій сесії. Це Алістер Макград, відомий британський богослов, священник Англіканської церкви, директор Центру науки та релігії Іана Рамсі, професор Оксфордського університету, автор близько 40 книг з історичного богослов'я, апологетики, богослов'я природи і природничих наук, а також дуже цікавих біографічних досліджень, зокрема стосовно Клайва Льюіса. Алістер Макград добре знайомий нашій аудиторії. Ще з 90-х років його книги перекладались російською мовою, зокрема книга «Богословська думка реформації», його класична праця «Вступ до християнського богослов'я», яка вже має біля 30 видань, його чудова праця «Хто винайшов Всесвіт», яка, власне, стосується взаємодії і науки, і також його книга присвячена історії протестантизму «Небезпечна ідея християнства», яку ми видавали і українською, і ось в мене тут є перед собою російською мовами. І також ще раніше в Україні були видані дві його книги українською мовою. Це «Інтелектуальні витоки європейської реформації» і, власне, книга небезпечна ідея християнства, яку ми також видали українською мовою. Ось, і зараз я хотів би ще також дати дещо технічної інформації. Як ми вже говорили, під час пленарних зустрічей, конференцій учасників буде можливість перекладу. З'явиться кнопка внизу, опція перекладу. І оскільки пленарні доповіді виголошуватимуться англійською мовою, то учасники можуть скористатися опцією українського перекладу. Для цього потрібно буде внизу на панелі управління Zoom обрати переклад український. Щоб слухати доповідь без оригінального англійського супроводу, потрібно натиснути Mute Original Audio. Після цього на панелі учасника має відображатися обраний канал перекладу, тобто український канал перекладу. Якщо учасник бажає слухати конференцію мовою оригіналу, то йому потрібно буде обрати канал перекладу English. І запитання до спікера можна ставити лише в чатовому режимі. Тому, будь ласка, якщо під час доповіді у вас з'являться запитання, ви їх пишіть, будь ласка, в чат, і після завершення доповіді модератор зачитає їх доповідачеві, і він дасть на них відповіді. Ось це основна така технічна інформація, яку я хотів би дати. Якщо у вас є якісь запитання технічного характеру, ви також можете писати в чат або нашим технічним помічникам Ользі Дятлик і Ксенії Трофимчук, і вони в оперативному порядку будуть ці проблеми намагатися розв'язувати.
Our first speaker this morning, Professor Alistair McGrath, does not need introduction in English for the English-speaking audience. He is widely known as the leading expert in the field of science and religion, and as a critic of the so-called new atheism. He has a double expertise. He holds both doctorates in molecular biophysics and also in theology. He is also the author of the numerous books. Some of them are even translated into Ukrainian, like, for instance, Roman just showed the Christianity's Dangerous Idea that was published by Duhi Litera Publishing House a couple years ago. So let me just switch briefly to the housekeeping remarks, technical issues. So now there will be available the button interpretation at the bottom of the Zoom window, and the keynote speaker and those who wish to hear the talk in the original language in English should choose the English channel, and those who want the translation need to switch to Ukrainian. At the end of the talk, we will come back to the common room, and I will collect questions from the chat and ask questions for Professor McGrath, summarize the question for Ukrainian audience, and also after the answer in English, I will summarize the answer for Ukrainian audience. Is that clear? All right, then please again join me in welcoming Professor Alistair McGrath as our first speaker this morning. Professor McGrath, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you today on the relation of the new atheism and the dialogue between science and religion. And the movement that's come to be known as the New Atheism arrived on the Western cultural scene in 2006, and it's generally reckoned to have fizzled out in 2018. Now, its leading figures were Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, both of whom declared that the natural sciences discredited religious belief as a relic of the past, with no place in the future of any civilized society which took science seriously. Now, this is not my view. And in this lecture, I want to begin by telling you a little about myself and my journeys in the territories of science and religion, and then we'll look at the views of the new atheism on this topic. Back in the late 1960s, I was a rebellious, free-thinking atheist with a love of the natural sciences and a dislike for ambiguity and uncertainty. And I was convinced that science and religious belief were incompatible. Science was about facts. Religious belief was about running away from reality, making up your beliefs to suit your tastes and your needs. So I became a committed atheist when I was 16 years old. And I think there were a number of reasons for this. One was my firm belief that science was the only reliable form of knowledge. And at that time, I was intolerant of uncertainty, and I loved science partly because it seemed to offer clear and certain answers to my questions about the universe. Science, I believed, was about proven truths that could be trusted and relied upon. And I also shared the widespread belief that science and religion were at war with each other. As I loved science, this meant I had to oppose the enemies of science. And of course, that included religion. At least that was what everyone thought back in the 1960s. Now, when I read new atheist works like Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, I become very nostalgic because that's what I thought 50 years ago, but not now, because I've moved on. So let's begin by thinking about this alleged warfare of science and religion, which I have to say is a defining belief of the new atheism. But as I'm sure you'll know, modern scholarship has thoroughly dismantled this idea that science and religion have always been at each other's throats. The modern scholarly consensus is that while there are points of tension between science and religion, the situation is complex. There's no right way of understanding their relationship, and it certainly isn't this myth of perennial warfare. For example, the British historian of science Thomas Dixon argues that the idea of a war between science and religion is a myth initially invented by Enlightenment rationalists in the late 1700s, was then propagated by Victorian freethinkers in the late 1800s, and is defended today by scientific atheists who don't know very much about history, like Richard Dawkins. And for Dixon, the idea of the perpetual warfare of science and religion is simply a piece of intellectual junk. And happily, historians now offer us much better models to understand the relation of science and religion, reflecting a massive increase in our knowledge and understanding of intellectual history. But 50 years ago, everyone, including myself, seems to have thought that science and religion were permanently and necessarily at war with each other. So in 1971, when I was 18 years old, I was awarded a scholarship to study chemistry at Oxford University. And I specialized in quantum theory. And I then stayed on at Oxford University to do doctoral research in molecular biophysics. I loved science back then, and I still do. But something happened to make me change the way I thought about religion and the relation between science and religion. So let me explain. A key influence here was Albert Einstein, who I studied in detail in my first year at Oxford as part of the theoretical chemistry course. And Einstein's writings show an interest in areas beyond the field of natural sciences, including ethics, politics, and, yes, religion. What makes Einstein particularly interesting is the way in which he sees all of these as interconnected. They're all part of a greater whole. And Einstein's basic insight is that science is wonderful, but it needs to be supplemented and enriched if we are to deal with the really important questions in life. Science, ethics, politics, religion, they're all different, but they all have a role to play in helping us to put together a big picture of life. Yes, science and religion are different, but that does not make them incompatible. For example, science and ethics are completely different fields of thought. But that doesn't mean that scientists can't be ethical people. So Einstein affirmed that science is a vitally important tool for investigating our world. But he also helped me to see that science illuminates only part of our big picture of reality, not the whole picture. And we need a bigger picture of reality than what science can offer if we're going to live authentic and meaningful lives. We need to be able to weave together an objective scientific account of our world with our deepest existential needs and longings and aspirations. In short, a scientific account of reality is incomplete. Yet I was not just reading Einstein during my first year in Oxford, I was also talking to scientists, many of whom were intelligent religious believers. And they explained to me how their faith motivated their love for science and how they found their science was enriched by their faith. So I realized I had a lot of thinking to do, and it became increasingly clear to me that I'd never really grasped what Christianity was all about. And through these conversations with reflective religious believers, I began to realize that Christianity was both intellectually and existentially exciting, and I embraced this new way of thinking and living. And I've been exploring and enjoying this ever since. So let me now turn to consider the new atheism, which is the focus of this lecture. The term New Atheism was invented in 2006 by the journalist Gary Wolfe, who was looking for a memorable and a simple slogan to refer to a group of three men who had attracted media attention through their best-selling popular books advocating atheism: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett. And Wolfe invented the phrase the New Atheism to designate this aggressive form of atheism, which ridiculed both religious belief itself and religious believers. So what was new about it? Well, as many pointed out, not very much. The New Atheism simply recycles older ideas that have been around since the 18th century. But you know, there is something new about it, and that is its rhetoric of ridicule and vilification of religious belief and religious believers, and its preference for attention-grabbing headlines rather than careful intellectual arguments. And for new atheist writers like Richard Dawkins, scientific theories are based purely on evidence. But for religion, on the other hand, simply runs away from the evidence because it's frightened of it. And Dawkins often argues there is no need for faith in science because the evidence for a correct conviction compels us to accept its truth. He first set out his views on this matter in his book, The Selfish Gene, and he doesn't seem to have changed his mind since then. So listen to this, and I quote from that book. Faith is a state of mind that leads people to believe something, it doesn't matter what, in the total absence of supporting evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous before the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. Now, do you see the problem with that statement? Because Dawkins fails to make the critical distinction between the total absence of supporting evidence and the absence of totally supporting evidence. Because scientific evidence is open to several interpretations, and we're often not compelled by that evidence to prefer one over the others. We have to make a judgment about which interpretation of the evidence seems to be the best. So let's look at an example, the current debate within cosmology over whether the Big Bang gave rise to a single universe or a series of universes, the so-called multiverse. Now, I have many distinguished scientific colleagues at Oxford who support the former approach, and equally distinguished scientific colleagues who support the latter. Both are real options for thinking and informed scientists who make their decisions on the basis of their judgments about how best to interpret the evidence. And they believe, but they cannot prove that their interpretation is correct. And this process, I have to say, rather inconveniently, doesn't fit at all with Dawkins' bold declaration that if there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway. Dawkins himself clearly believes in the multiverse theory, but the evidence for that just isn't good enough to compel him or anyone else to accept it. Science just isn't like that. Because you see, in its rigorous sense, proof applies only to logic or to mathematics. We can prove that 2 and 2 make 4. We can prove that the whole is greater than the part. But it's important to avoid confusing provability with truth. As you may know, the great mathematician Kurt Gödel famously proved that however many rules of inference we may formulate, there will always be valid inferences that are not covered by them. In other words, there are some statements that are true that we may not be able to be shown true. And that's why so many standard scientific textbooks emphasize that science rests on faith. Now, I must move into a problem with this, because faith is just part of human life and plays an important role in science as it does everywhere else. However, the new atheism seems to have some kind of aversion to using the word faith, apparently believing this is a specifically religious idea. And faith, as Richard Dawkins tells us, is invariably blind faith. Well, clearly it is not. Belief is just a normal human way of making sense of a complex world in which we cannot absolutely prove our beliefs. And in the end, science gives us reasons for believing that certain things are true, while at the same time insisting that we realize that future generations may want to challenge those beliefs. After all, many scientific theories that were once thought to be completely reliable are now known to be wrong. But there's another point to be made here. Some important areas of human thinking clearly lie beyond the legitimate scope of the natural sciences, such as the non-empirical notions of value and meaning. And we can't read these off the world. They can't be measured as if they're constants of nature. And it's been known since the 18th century that there are formidable intellectual obstacles in the way of anyone wanting to argue that science can generate moral values, most notably the impossibility of arguing from observed facts to moral values. Now, earlier I made some criticisms of the warfare model of the relation of science and faith, and I suggested this was intellectually simplistic and inaccurate historically. And it's much more reliable to think of human knowledge as a spectrum of possibilities. Some knowledge is scientific, some is historical, some is ethical, some is religious. So let me explore this question in dialogue with Mary Midgley, one of Britain's best known and respected public philosophers. Midgley died recently, aged 99, and I got to know her when I lectured at the University of Newcastle back in 2008. I had given a talk about Richard Dawkins' views on science and religion, and Midgley asked me to talk more about this question over a cup of tea afterwards. So let me tell you what she thinks, as this is very relevant to our topic in this lecture. Midgley insists that different intellectual disciplines use different intellectual toolkits. And I think this idea of an intellectual toolkit is really useful. And Midgley points out that these different toolkits were designed to ask different questions. This means that there are certain questions that are really important to us, which science can't answer using its own toolkits. And Midgley's concern here is not only to avoid the dangers of scientific overreach, but to avoid the intellectual impoverishment, which results from limiting our knowledge and our understanding of the world to that which results from a single disciplinary approach. We have to use different intellectual toolkits to explore different regions of the spectrum of knowledge. So listen to what Midgley has to say. No one pattern of thought, not even in physics, is so fundamental that all others will eventually be reduced to it. Instead, for most important questions in human life, a number of different conceptual toolboxes always have to be used together. And Midgley sums this up in her final book, What is Philosophy For? And again, listen to what she has to say. On the one hand, I want to emphasize that there really is only one world, but also on the other, that this world is so complex, so various, that we need dozens of distinct thought patterns to understand it. We can't reduce all these ways of thinking to any single model. Instead, we have to use all our philosophical tools to bring these distinct kinds of thought together. Now, I hope you can see the point she's making. Science cannot answer all our questions about life. It's very good at answering scientific questions, but not moral, existential, or religious questions, especially anything to do with values or meaning in life. Again, Midgley's point is we have to use different intellectual toolkits, different methods to explore different regions in the spectrum of knowledge. Yet, the new atheism dogmatically insists that science is our only research tool. But all our research tools are developed with a specific task in mind. The fact that a tool works very well in measuring temperatures or looking at stars does not mean that that same tool can tell us what is good or what is meaningful. It's the same with science. It works for some tasks, but not for all. We need more than science to answer life's big questions. And that's not a criticism of science. So let me give you an example to help you understand this point. Let's do a mental experiment. I want you to imagine that I'm showing you a thermometer. There's a thermometer, okay? This is an instrument. It's a tool, and it works really well. Well, I want to know my temperature. For example, do I have COVID? So it's a great tool. But supposing I were to argue like this, because this thermometer works so well in telling my temperature, why not use it for everything else? Surely the fact it works in one very specific area entitles me to extend its use to every area, including questions of value or meaning. So suppose I wanted to know the meaning of life. I might look at my thermometer. No, because the thermometer has detected no meaning in life, I might say there is no meaning in life. Now, I think, and I hope that you'll feel this is a very bad argument. You see the point I'm trying to make? We cannot use physics to determine the meaning of life or how we become good people. Physics wasn't designed to do this. These questions lie beyond the scope of the scientific method, and its toolkit was not designed with these questions in mind. So let me return to Albert Einstein. In a lecture of 1939, Einstein declared that the natural sciences were outstanding, excellent in their sphere of competence. But he entered a note of caution. What about ethics or questions of meaning? Listen to this very important statement from that lecture by Einstein. The scientific method can teach us nothing else beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other. Human beings, Einstein declared, need more than what he called a purely rational conception of our existence is able to offer. And for Einstein, the fundamental beliefs that really matter to us cannot be established scientifically. Now, Einstein was emphatic. This is not a criticism of science. It's just a proper recognition of its limits. Now, Einstein was very clear that going beyond science in the human quest for values and personal meaning is not about lapsing into some kind of superstitious irrationality. Listen to this. He writes, objective knowledge provides us with powerful instruments for the achievement of certain ends. But the ultimate goal itself and the longing to reach it must come from another source. Now, what he is saying here is that science can help us achieve certain goals that we think are good and right, but it cannot in itself identify what possible goals are good and right or motivate us to achieve them. That has to come from somewhere beyond science. Now, again, let me make clear, Einstein and I are not criticizing science. Science is a wonderful toolbox for exploring our world. It's just we need other toolboxes as well. So let me make a provocative point. In the end, it seems to me that the new atheism did not offer a viable alternative to religion. In fact, in the view of many people, it simply morphed into its own kind of religion, with its own prophets and its own sacred texts. Let me tell you a true story. I gave a lecture some years ago on the religious views of Richard Dawkins, and I showed how Dawkins' atheism was not adequately grounded in argument or in evidence, and pointed out he depended on a very inadequate engagement of natural sciences in reaching his atheist conclusions. Now, after this lecture, I was confronted by a very angry young man who told me I had destroyed his faith. He told me his atheism rested on the authority of Richard Dawkins, and I had thrown his life into turmoil by showing him he couldn't trust Richard Dawkins. Now, part of me felt that that was just too bad, and he ought to be more critical about evaluating evidence. but you can see the point. For this man, Dawkins was a prophet, an authority. He had written what amounted to an authoritative text, and I had shown that it was wrong at certain points. No wonder this man's faith was so badly damaged by my lecture. So let me tell you about Sam Harris. Sam Harris, as you may know, is a leading voice within the New Atheism. And what is interesting is that many new atheists have been seriously embarrassed by Harris's interest in Eastern mysticism. Surely, they argued, Harris ought to reject any form of spirituality and simply delight in the pure rationalism of atheism. But you see, Harris had realized human beings need more than just a rational belief system. A purely rationalist atheism was existentially inadequate and deficient. And human beings need something more, something that engages with them at the deepest level. And of course, that is what Christianity does remarkably well. So let me set out 3 ways of understanding how science and faith relate to each other. You don't have to choose one of these 3 ways over the others, as each of them has its own strengths and merits. And I'm going to talk you through each of them and help you get a sense of their strengths and weaknesses. So here they are. First, science and faith offer different perspectives on reality. Second, science and faith answer questions at different levels. And third, science and faith offer us different maps of reality. So let's look at each of these. The first of these is that science and faith offer different perspectives on reality. And I learned this approach personally from Charles Coulson, who was Oxford University's professor of theoretical chemistry back in the early 1970s. I'd only been a Christian for some months, and I had not found a satisfactory way of holding my love of science and my growing faith together. And Coulson explained to me that they could be seen as offering different perspectives on a complex world. And a full account, a full description of any complex reality requires these different perspectives to be brought together and then to be integrated into a single coherent picture. The whole is the sum of these multiple perspectives. I mentioned Mary Midgley, and she develops a similar approach using the image of windows rather than perspectives. We need many windows if we are to represent the complexity of reality, reflecting the fact that there are many independent forms and sources of knowledge. And she argues it's helpful to think of the world as a huge aquarium. So listen to the way she develops this analogy of a large aquarium with lots of viewing windows into its many regions. We cannot see it as a whole from above, so we peer in at it through a number of small windows. We can eventually make quite a lot of sense of this habitat if we patiently put together the data from different angles. But if we insist that our own window is the only one worth looking through, we shall not get very far. Now, I think this is a very helpful approach. When we're dealing with a complex structure, we have to approach it from many angles. And our account of that structure must weave together the insights gained from each angle. We look at the world through many windows, and we're tempted to limit reality to what we can see through our own window. So that's the first approach. Let's look at another. The second approach argues that science and faith answer life's questions at different levels. Here's an analogy. Think of a kettle that is boiling. This analogy, as far as I can see, was first used by the distinguished geologist Frank Rhodes, who was president of Cornell University. So why is the kettle boiling? Now, Rhodes points out that this same question can be answered at different levels, so that no one answer is definitive or exhaustive. Now, here's a scientific answer to the question, why is the kettle boiling? energy is being converted, and that raises the temperature of the water to its boiling point. Now, that answer is correct. But another answer can be given to that same question, why is the kettle boiling? And this answer works at a different level. Listen to the second answer. The kettle is boiling because I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. Now, that answer is also correct. Each of these two answers is valid. So let's make sure we appreciate this point. If the scientific answer is right, does that mean that the other one, the tea one, is wrong? No, no. Let's listen to Frank Rhodes' own answer to that question. He writes, now, these are different answers, but both are true. Both are complementary and not competitive. There is a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. And you can see Rhodes' basic point. Both answers are right because they are concerned with different levels of reality. And Rhodes spoke of a complementarity of description, which tries to capture at least something of the total picture of reality. To give a complete account of the reasons for the kettle boiling, you have to identify all the factors that are involved. So this framework, I think, allows us to explore the idea that the natural sciences are mainly concerned with understanding how things function, how things work, whereas religion is more concerned with what they mean. They are different levels of engagement with human existence, but they can be brought together to give a fuller and richer understanding of the distinct nature of humanity. Let's move on then to the third approach. And this third approach is found in the writings of Mary Midgley, a philosopher who I've already referenced in this lecture. This approach is based on the idea that science and faith offer us different maps of reality. And Midgley suggests that we need to use multiple maps, each of which is incomplete in itself, in our attempts to make as much sense as we can of our world and to live meaningfully within it. So consider an atlas, which provides us with many maps of a region, for example, North America or Europe. So why do we need multiple maps of these landscapes in the first place? Midgley points out that no map can show everything. Each map concentrates on answering a specific set of questions. So a physical map of Europe shows us the features of its landscapes, its rivers, its lakes, its mountains. But a political map shows the borders of its nation states, shows where one nation ends and another begins. Now listen carefully. The first might be useful to a tourist who is interested in mountain scenes, but the second is helpful to a refugee who is seeking asylum. Midgley's point is that, and I quote, there is only one world, but a big one. And this big world needs many maps to do justice to its vast scope and range and to the multiple interests and concerns of its inhabitants. Now, I think you can work out how this applies in the case of science and faith. Science maps our world at one level. It explains how it functions. Religion maps our world at another level, explaining what it means. And we need to be able to superimpose those maps so that all this information is at our disposal. Yes, each map is to be respected, but it depends on a specific way of exploring our world, and it's incomplete. It needs supplementation with other maps. A scientific map helps us to understand how we as human beings function, and that is important medically. But a theological map helps us to understand our deepest needs, and that's important spiritually. So I've talked about three ways of thinking about the relation of the sciences and religious faith. They offer us different perspectives, different levels, and different maps. Each fills in part of a big picture, but not the whole of that big picture. And that was the big problem with the new atheism, because the new atheism limited reality to what science could prove. And that's a very small world. It's also a changing world, as the new atheism seems to overlook the fact that scientific theories change over time. Remember, back in 1900, scientists thought the universe has always been in existence. Today, they believe it came into existence, giving a new credibility to the Christian idea of creation. Now, there is much more that needs to be said, but I hope that this short lecture will help you begin to engage with the relation of science and religion. We need to move beyond the outdated polemics of the new atheism and discover how science and faith can complement and enrich each other. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Professor McGrath, for very informative and thought-provoking lecture. I hope I see that Alexander is finishing the translation, right? Alexander is all done. Excellent. So Olya, now we all come back in one common room, right? Okay, now the translation option will be disabled. So we do have questions that I am now collecting from the chat. The first question for Professor McGrath is you've mentioned a lot about the contribution of new atheists, particularly Richard Dawkins. But at the same time, this debate is not just a debate within the intellectual framework or cultural wars, but it is known that new atheists, particularly Richard Dawkins, is one of the lobbyists in the United States of the they try to influence the educational system within the secondary schools. So what is being taught for children within the educational system of the United States. Can you comment a little bit what is the situation in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom, with regard to the education, particularly secondary education, public schools and religious schools? How does that work from the perspective of a science-religion debate in British society, and what are the tendencies?
Thank you for a very good question. In Britain, initially, at the beginning of the new atheism, there was this feeling that this is the way ahead, this is the future. In effect, science is about atheism, and therefore science ought to be linked with atheism as part of a coherent way of thinking. And then two things began to happen, which really called that into question. First of all, philosophers pointed out that the new atheism was not just science. It was actually science and a philosophical materialism and an aggressive atheism. In other words, it was a particular way of interpreting science. It wasn't science as if science is something that is neutral. It was science interpreted in a certain way. And people began to react against this, feeling that this was in effect a dogmatic imposition of a particular way of science. And
Professor McGrath, could I interrupt you for a second, because I will be translating in chunks. Okay, so I will translate this part of the answer and then we carry on, all right? Отже, питання полягає в тому, що нові атеїсти, і, зокрема, біолог Річард Докінс, вони не лише дебатують в рамках інтелектуального дебату чи, скажімо, культурних війн між експертами, але багато з них є лобістами зміни в освітній системі. Зокрема, Річард Докінс намагається різними способами впливати на контент, на зміст освіти в американських середніх школах, що викладається дітям на предметах природничих наук, про науку і релігію. І питання полягало в тому, яка є ситуація в британському суспільстві і в британській системі освіти, в публічних школах, в школах релігійних громад. І ось відповідь професора Макграфа звучить приблизно так. Я сумую, що історично все-таки так склалося, що наука сприймається в людській свідомості приблизно як синонім атеїзму, що це приблизно одна послідовна система, що якщо є науковий світогляд, то він мав би передбачати атеїзм як частину. Але філософи внесли в цей дебат нові відтінки. Зокрема, вони згадали, що новий атеїзм, він не синонімічний з наукою, а що це певний спосіб інтерпретації реальності, який має науку як компонент, але також має філософський компонент, який передбачає матеріалізм, який передбачає також певний світогляд. Тобто вже є розуміння в британському суспільстві, що новий атеїзм не синонімічний з наукою, але це є певний світогляд, який передбачає також і пакет філософських тверджень і тез. Professor McGrath, please carry on.
I'll carry on. Thank you. And two more points, which I think are very important. The next point is that many critics in Britain and North America pointed out that Richard Dawkins seemed to be simply replicating the scientific atheism that was taught in the Soviet Union during the 1950s. And this was seen as, in effect, a dogmatic interpretation of the sciences, which was being used for an ideological agenda. And I think that's a very important point. And the final point I'll make briefly is that there was a growing reaction because many people felt that this was a serious misrepresentation of what religious people believed. And that was, in effect, that there was a massive disparity between the way the new atheism talked about Christianity, about Judaism, about Islam, and what they were actually like. And so people began to say, this is simply a gross misrepresentation of religion, and we cannot accept this in modern British society. So there's a very clear reaction against it, because it distorted religion and was not fair to it.
Два наступних пункти, відповідаючи на це питання. Перше, що багато дослідників зауважили, що, зокрема, Річард Докінс просто повторює догматичний атеїзм, який був частиною ідеології навіть Радянського Союзу. Тобто в його арсеналі є догматичний атеїзм як ідеологія, дуже схожа до того, як атеїстичний режим функціонував в комуністичний час. А другий пункт полягає в тому, що з'явилася потужна реакція на те, що нові атеїсти, і Річард Докінс, зокрема, вони спотворюють християнський світогляд. Іншими словами, те, що вони представляють як християнство, є для християн просто карикатурою. християни не впізнають ані своїх якби віровчительних, ані своїх постулатів, так як це презентує новий атеїзм і Річард Докінс. І власне реакція полягає зростаюча в тому, що так як презентує новий атеїзм християнство не впізнає себе в ньому і відповідно не вважає, що ці аргументи мають зміст і стосуються власне християнського світогляду. Thank you very much, Professor McGrath. So we have many more questions. I will try to summarize some of them, and we'll see how we do in terms of time. We still have about 15 minutes. So the questions comes from Serhii Chepara, and he is interested to hear that well, the most of the scientists have in fact different views in comparison to, let's say, theists on the question of the origin of the universe. And the question is, who or what or who do you think might be the arbiter or a judge to consider these two, so to say, parallel set of questions on the origin of the universe, and what might be the dividing line between the believers and their views on the origin of the universe and the scientists who are mostly atheists. So this is question number one, and the second question is concerned. To what extent do you think there might be a compromise when it comes to Christians who are inclined to be more of a fundamentalist view when it comes to the origin of the universe as it is described in the first book of the Bible, in the Genesis and the 6 days of creation. And they tend to take this essentially as part of the revelation and part of their faith. But at the same time, we have new knowledge from a scientific perspective that helps us to explain these things. So what is the right balance between Genesis and what we know from the modern science? Now I will quickly summarize questions in Ukrainian for the Ukrainian audience, and then we'll go with the answer. So, якщо хтось не бачив запитань в чаті, то я коротко сформулюю, що більшість науковців мають відмінне розуміння походження Всесвіту від теїстів. Одні кажуть, що це їх пісочниця, інші кажуть, що це саме справа богослов'я. І питання полягає, хто міг би бути суддею і арбітром, і як провести межу між наукою і богословським світоглядом. А друге питання – це те, що американські християни, які більш схильні до фундаменталістських поглядів, сприймають буквально історію сотворення з книги «Буття», 6 днів сотворення, і це частина їхньої віри. І тут де є компроміс між тим, що ми знаємо з наукової точки зору, і тим, що ми віримо як християни. Professor McGrath, I think we can start answering these two questions.
Thank you. Well, I'll begin by answering the first question and then allow you to translate.
Mhm.
On the first question, I think it's very important to remember that the dominant view within the scientific community for 1,000 years was the universe has always existed. And that's always been in tension with the Christian idea that universe came into being. And then in the 20th century, science changed its mind. And that's a very substantial sea change. I think it's very important to emphasize how big a change that is. And the question we have to ask is whether the scientific narrative of origination can be correlated with the Christian narrative of creation. I think they can. But let's look at the scientific community, because the scientific community itself is divided, because the evidence can be interpreted in several ways about whether there is a single universe or whether there is a series of universes. And of course, the evidence is not conclusive. And therefore, you have to make a judgment. And at the moment, it's not at all clear what that judgment is going to be. So I think it's very important to emphasize the scientific community has agreed the universe had an origin, but not whether there is one universe or whether there are multiple universes. And
okay,
that,
I will go with this and then we'll carry on, okay?
Thank you.
Отже, домінантним поглядом на питання походження Всесвіту впродовж 2000 історії був погляд про те, що світ завжди існував, він був. І це завжди конфліктувало з християнським світоглядом і з поглядом Святого Письма. В 20 столітті сталася колосальна зміна, бо зі сторони науки, ви знаєте, це пов'язано з питанням Великого Вибуху, Big Bang, що світ мав свій початок. І ми навіть сьогодні недооцінюємо, наскільки колосальна трансформація сталася в 20 столітті, коли з наукової перспективи прийшло твердження про те, що світ не існував вічно, а що він мав свій початок. Але це розділило наукову спільноту, тому що на сьогодні щодо питання походження і сотворення, тому що одні науковці сьогодні поділяють погляд, що є один світ, один всесвіт, але є також теорія так звана мультивсесвіту, і немає консенсусу між всередині наукової спільноти щодо цих питань, чи є мультивсесвіт, чи є один світ, в якому живемо ми. Professor McGrath, please carry on.
I will answer your second question now, which is about the book of Genesis. And I think it's very important to emphasize that there is one thing to say that the Bible has authority, but it's another thing to recognize we have to interpret the Bible correctly. And sometimes we may misread or misinterpret the Bible. I think that's a very important point to make, because certainly if we look at early Christian exegesis of Genesis chapter 1, we find that many early Christian writers, for example, Augustine in the year 401, will say that as he reads the book of Genesis, it refers to an initial act of creation that is instantaneous, followed by a process of development or emergence, in which, in effect, what was laid down in creation unfolds or expands to give this richer vision of the universe. And interestingly, Augustine picks up on the phrase in the book of Genesis, the earth brought forth, the earth brought forth, which he takes to mean that in effect the natural processes under divine guidance led to the development of the world as we now see it. So the point I want to emphasize here is that there are multiple ways of reading the book of Genesis. And sometimes we need to rediscover older ways of reading the book of Genesis rather than the very literalist ways that very often are linked with American fundamentalism. I think that's a very important point to make. There's a rich tradition of Christian interpretation of the book of Genesis, particularly in the Eastern Church and the early Western Church, which I think are very helpful in beginning to orient us towards these questions.
Сумуючи відповідь професора Макграфа, отже, важливим щодо питання сотворення і книги буття і Святого Письма. Отже, очевидно, що книга буття має авторитет, як і все Святе Письмо, і це початкова точка, з якої ми, як християни, починаємо. Але якщо подивитися глибше в історію інтерпретації, в екзегезу, то ми побачимо, що не все так чорно-біло. Наприклад, Августин бере уривки з книги буття, з історії сотворення і починає їх інтерпретувати в такий спосіб, який дозволяє нам робити подальші кроки. Наприклад, він каже, що земля породила. І це ця фраза з книги буття, її можна інтерпретувати в такий спосіб, що є природні процеси, які ведуть до того, що ми бачимо сьогодні як Боже сотворіння. Тобто, іншими словами, що є процеси, природні процеси, які Святе Письмо описує, але їх можна спокійно брати і інтерпретувати як певну тяглість, як Божий задум в певному процесі. І якщо ми на це накладаємо певні способи читання Святого Письма, не буквалістичні, не буквальна інтерпретація питань, то це відкриває цілу нову перспективу на інтерпретацію історій сотворення зі Святого Письма з перспективи якби герменевтики і екзегези. І очевидно, що тут якби фундаменталізм в американському контексті це одна історія, але є багато інших способів, які дозволяють зберігати віру і шукати якби більш гармонійний погляд на історію сотворення, біблійну перспективу і питання віри. We still have a couple more minutes, and I will try to pick up another question from the chat that we have. There is a question that goes like this. Do you think that that the confrontation between science and religion also influenced or caused to a certain extent the crisis in humanities? Do you think that this kind of tension between science and religion has influence over the crisis we experience nowadays in humanities? And can we reduce religion to the sphere of ethics and morals? So there's this kind of two questions that are interrelated. So would you comment on this, please?
Thank you. I think this is a very good question. Many people, I will be one of them, would say that actually the tensions between science and religion are reflective of a broader tension between science and the humanities. And there are writers like Richard Dawkins who would want to argue that the humanities have no place. Philosophy, for example, the arts are an irrelevance because science is able to answer all of our questions. And so I think in the United States and in Great Britain, many humanities faculties find themselves under pressure because they are unable to meet the criteria of scientific proof that Dawkins wants. But on the other hand, they're engaging with really important issues like beauty, like the importance of meaning, like ethical values. And these are seen by many people as being enormously important. And so one of the points I'm going to make is that there are many who criticize the new atheism for being hostile to human culture. In other words, to anything that has to do with beauty, the arts, with poetry, with the arts, with the performing arts, with philosophy, and of course, with religion. So I think that that's a very important point to make. There's a broader conflict going on here about science as simply giving us simple answers, simple questions, and the deeper human quest for meaning that can't be reduced to those categories.
Отже, дуже добре питання, і конфлікт чи тертя між релігією і наукою, воно справді не лише сприймається так вузько, але сприймається також як і конфлікт ширший між наукою і, тобто, природничими науками і гуманітаристикою, і сферою гуманітаристики. І такі особи, як Річард Докінс, притримуються погляду, що наука, власне, може відповісти на всі питання, і таким чином гуманітаристика із її дисциплінами є зайвими. Тобто погляд Річарда Докінса, що гуманітаристика взагалі не потрібна, тому що наука здатна дати відповіді на всі сфери людського життя. І викликом є, що гуманітарії, які намагаються діалогізувати в цій системі координат, не завжди можуть відповідати в критеріях доказів, так як це вимагають нові атеїсти, і Річард Докінс зокрема. І тому такі сфери, як мистецтво, філософія, які мають до діла з красою, поезією, вони стають частиною цього дискурсу без цього наукового позитивістського, так би мовити, апарату. І, власне, відповідь професора Макграфа полягає в тому, що неможливо в цих сферах мистецтва, філософії, поезії, краси задовольнитися відповідями, які походять тільки з дискурсу науки. Це різні сфери, і вони обидві мають право на існування. Thank you very much. I think we are approaching the time limit. So I would like to thank Professor McGrath for this really thought-provoking and highly informative lecture, and particularly for this session of question and answers. Thank you very much, Professor McGrath.
Thank you very much.
Our second speaker today is Professor Petros Vassiliadis. And this morning, this plenary session will give us the both perspectives, Western and Eastern, on the question of science and religion. Professor McGrath didn't need much of an introduction for the English-speaking audience. The same goes with Professor Petros Vassiliadis, who is widely known within global orthodoxy as the leading scholar. He got his education in King's College London and in Heidelberg in Germany. He is author of numerous books and articles, and he's a board member of numerous professional association and organization. It will take me forever to read just sections of his extensive CV. I can only say that even the question of Ukrainian autocephaly and recent events of the creation of Orthodox Church of Ukraine took his attention, and he wrote a couple of very expert articles on the Ukrainian question and the question of Tomos and the autocephaly of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Professor Vassiliadis, we are very grateful to you for your willingness to be with us at this conference. And I would like to take this opportunity to give the word for Roman Solovey, who will briefly introduce you for the Ukrainian audience.
Шановні колеги, Петрос Василіадіс є директором аспірантури православної екуменічної теології Міжнародного грецького університету і також почесним професором університету Арістотеля у Салоніках. Викладав багато років Новий Завіт, місіологію та міжрелігійний діалог на кафедрі теології цього університету. І також, як запрошений професор, викладав у різних університетах США, Європи та Азії. Ще з 1986 року він є співредактором грецької біблійної серії «Герменевтика Нового Завіту», а також «Бібліотека Бібліка», редактором екуменічної серії «Еклесія Койнонія Ойкумени», редактором серії «Міжнародні дослідження сформування християнства та іудаїзму» Університету Південної Флориди. Незважаючи на те, що його основна спеціалізація лежить у сфері біблеїстики, він впродовж багатьох років цілеспрямовано взаємодіяв з іншими сферами теології. Констатуючи недостатню біблійну основу православного богослов'я, головним чином внаслідок переважання інституційного вираження церкви за рахунок її харизматичного характеру, він намагався у своїх роботах досягнути творчої зустрічі церковної практики, сучасної теологічної проблематики із основоположною для усіх християн біблійною традицією. Розуміючи роздробленість сучасної богословської науки, її фрагментарність та бажаючи подолати цей стан, професор Василіадіс поширював сферу своїх досліджень на такі різноманітні, але взаємопов'язані теми, як екуменічний рух, місіологія, літургічна теологія та богословська освіта у глобальному контексті. Свої міркування він висловив у понад 20 книгах і приблизно у 300 наукових статей та інших наукових публікацій. І справді, як вже ми чули в англійському представленні, буквально перелік усіх його досягнень, нагород, публікацій зайняв би у нас, мабуть, половину часу його виступу, тому на цьому ми зупинимося. На сторінці Академія ЕДУ нашого доповідача є його детальний CV, з яким ви можете познайомитися і зрозуміти, що насправді це дуже важливий, впливовий і такий багатогранний сучасний православний теолог, який до якоїсь міри доповнить цю перспективу, котру тільки що представив професор Алістер Макград. Тому, будь ласка, професор Петрос Василіадіс, ми будемо раді послухати вашу лекцію.
I am very grateful both for your introduction and for the invitation to take part. I feel a Ukrainian in a way. Allow me also to introduce myself from a different perspective. And I am encouraged to do this from the title of my colleague from Lateranum, Professor Bofi, that mathematics is a bridge to the church more religious science relations. And I have studied mathematics. However, I am not going to deal as my predecessor on natural science and religion and the church, but on a different issue, the anthropological dimension of the church-science relations, which is an issue that will occupy the future of Orthodox theology, but also Christianity and religion in general. It is almost impossible, however, to understand these relations without examining the Christian church's attitude towards modernity. But before doing this, I need to define what orthodoxy, this very precious for us, but at the same time ill-treated, misunderstood, and even badly misused or misinterpreted, as Professor McGrath said, entity really means. Defining orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is normally defined in confessional or denominational terms. In other words, as an eastern branch of Christianity, which was separated from the West around the beginning of the second millennium. This is at least how the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church describes the Orthodox Church. And I quote, a family of churches situated mainly in Eastern Europe. Each member church is independent in its internal administration, autocephaly in other words, but all share the same faith and are in communion with one another, acknowledging the honorary primacy of the Patriarch of Constantinople, end of quote. This definition no longer holds true. According to its most serious interpreters, Orthodoxy refers to the wholeness of the people of God who share the right conviction, this is the orthodoxa, right opinion, concerning the event of God's salvation in Christ and his church, but at the same time, the right expression of this faith, orthopraxia. Therefore, orthodoxia leads to the maximum possible application in orthopraxia of charismatic life in the freedom of the Holy Spirit in all aspects of daily public life, social and cosmic alike. Everyone, therefore, is invited by orthodoxy to transcend confessions and inflexible institutions without necessarily denying them. The late Professor Nikos Nisiotis, my colleague from the University of Athens, has reminded us that orthodoxy is not to be identified only with us Orthodox in the historical sense and with all our limitations and shortcomings. And I quote, we should never forget that this term was given to the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church as a whole over against the heretics who, of their own choice, split from the main body of the Church. The term, therefore, is exclusive for all those who willingly fall away from this historical stream of the life of the one Church, but it is inclusive for those who profess their spiritual belonging to that stream, end of quote. The term orthodoxy, therefore, has more or less ecclesial rather than confessional or ideological connotations. This ecclesial understanding of orthodoxy has been first put forward by the late George Florovsky, who, speaking at an ecumenical meeting in the name of the one Church, has declared, and I quote, the Church is first of all a worshipping community. Worship comes first, doctrine and discipline second. The lex orandi has a privileged priority in the life of the Christian Church. The lex credendi depends on the devotional experience and vision of the Church. Out of the three main characteristics that generally constitute the essence of the Orthodox theology, namely its Eucharistic, Trinitarian, and hesychastic dimension, only the first one can bear a universal and ecumenical significance. If the last dimension marks hesychasm, a decisive development in Eastern Christian theology and spirituality after the eventual split from the Western Christianity. And if the Trinitarian dimension constitutes the supreme expression of Christian theology ever produced by human thought in its attempt to grasp the mystery of God after Christianity's dynamic encounter with the Greek culture, it was nevertheless only because of the Eucharistic experience, the matrix of all theology, ecclesiology, and spirituality of Christianity, that all theological and spiritual climaxes in the Orthodox Church have been actually developed. The Eucharist is always understood as a proleptic manifestation of the kingdom of God. What is nevertheless of paramount importance is that this kingdom is expected to culminate at the eschaton. Eschatology therefore constitutes the central and primary aspect of ecclesiology. Everything belongs to the kingdom. The church, in her institutional expression, does not administer or reality. She only prepares the way to the kingdom. She is an image of the kingdom. That is why, although to the eyes of the historian and the sociologist, the church is yet another human institution, to the theologian, it is primarily a mystery. And we very often call her an icon of the kingdom to come. Eschatology, however, does not by any means detach the church from the world. We should never forget that theology and the church exist not for themselves, but for the world. The relationship between the ecclesial community and our modern pluralistic society, basically based on science, is one of the most important chapters in the church's witness today. And I will go to the first chapter, which is Orthodoxy, or the church and modernity. I will focus on three areas in an effort to shed light to this issue. First, the church's attitude towards modernity and science, the new understanding of Christian mission, and finally, third, the anthropological dimension of the church-science relations. Science is definitely related to, and for most scholars, is the result of modernity, at least in the modern sense. To properly define the faith-science dichotomy, it is necessary to briefly locate it within the framework of modernity and the dialectics between modernity and postmodernity. Something was hinted by Professor McGrath. In the pre-modern world, the sacred cosmic stories of all religions provided, each for its own culture, of course, the most public and certain knowledge human beings believed they had about reality. After the Enlightenment, in other words, in modernity, the secular science replaced religion as the most certain knowledge that human beings have for the world, whereas the religious stories, values, and views were reduced to matters of personal and private belief and opinion. That is why one of the ideals of modernity was the separation of the church from the state, the relegation of religion to the private realm, and the declaration of the public realm as secular, coming from the Latin term seculum, which is age, in other words, this present world. In other words, free from all religious influence, because the religion, especially the church, focus mainly, as we said, on the world to come. During almost the entire period of modernity, Christianity was reserved, if not hostile, to the principles of modernity. This is more evident in our Eastern Christian world, which has never undergone a full process of modernization. Postmodernity is an ambiguous term used to name an ambiguous time of transition in history. It was discovered in postmodernity that even the scientific knowledge, it was perfectly explained by Professor McGrath, was also an imaginative. This made people aware that their perspective, modern views of the world, could not automatically be assumed to be objective description. All these developments have brought again religion and the church in particular back into the public domain, or at least interest. This made theology adopt a new approach and articulate what is generally called public theology. I firmly believe that the Orthodox the church cannot exercise her mission in today's pluralistic world in a meaningful and effective way without a reassessment of the present context, without a certain encounter with modernity. If today this encounter is possible and even desirable, this is because of the undisputed tradition of our culture to a new era, the postmodern era, that brought with it, as I said, the resurgence of religion, which, however, can be both a hope and a threat. Peter Berger, a sociologist, half a century ago described the attitude of the church toward the modernist revolution in terms of two opposite positions: accommodation and resistance. In my view, both these positions are inadequate. Resistance is no longer suggested as a practical solution, going against science and so on and so forth, because of the progress made in the theology of mission. I will explain later. As to the accommodation, the impossibility of its application because the church and her theology are incompatible with
Так, так, будь ласка, Олеже, продовжуйте читати з дозволу спікера.
на всі модерністські виклики сучасності. Сьогодні в галузі світової місії ми говоримо про екумену, яка має прийти, згідно з термінологією послання апостола Павла до євреїв, 2 глава, 5 стишок. Також можна порівняти із 13 главою, 14 стишком і далі. Як це описано в книзі об'явлення, також глава 21, 22, як відкрите суспільство, де може відбуватися чесний діалог між церквою і наукою, а також між існуючими живими культурами. Світове плюралістичне суспільство може і повинно стати домогосподарством, ойкос, де кожен відкритий для іншого, як відкритий для найвищого, так само, як і відкритий до найвищого іншого, тобто Бога, і де всі можуть спільно жити та сприятливо формувати загальне благо, зважаючи на їхні пошуки та погляди, а також на множинність та різницю їхньої ідентичності. Всі ці нові події нещодавно були підтверджені священним і Великим собором, який відбувся в Криті 2016 року. Ядро прийнятих документів якого було погоджено та проголосовано усіма 14 автокефальними церквами, включаючи навіть тими, які не брали в ньому участь. Це відповідний для науки абзац у посланні, який узагальнив результати Ради простими словами. І тут цитуємо з цього документу. Що стосується питання відносин християнської віри до природничих наук, православна церква не прагне брати під свій контроль наукові дослідження і не виносить суджень по кожній науковій проблемі. Церква дякує Богові, який наділив вчених даром відкривати непізнані горизонти божественного творіння. Сучасний розвиток природничих наук і технологій призвело до радикальних змін в нашому житті. Вони приносять значну користь, полегшуючи наше повсякденне життя, допомагаючи виліковувати важкі захворювання.
Excuse me, we will shortly interrupt and go back to translation. We are so happy that Professor Vassiliadis is back. And Oleg, can you help please, Professor, where to start?
Just tell me when, at which point you are now.
It's page number 4.
It's page number 4.
Yes.
Okay.
Would you like to read from the place where you stopped? What would be a better solution?
Let me see.
Which paragraph are you in, Oleg? What was the latest that you...
I just finished quoting the document that was endorsed by all 14 autocephalous churches, paragraph 7.
Okay.
Okay.
So it is page 4, you said. And okay, I will continue with the anthropological dimension of the Orthodox science relations. Is it okay?
Yes, yes.
Now, the anthropological dimension of the problem of church science, the relation, is the most important ethical issue we Orthodox and all Christians especially face. It is the concept of human identity, the most debated issues of which are in our days the gender theory in general and the nature and role of women in church and society in particular. We all know that in the long history of the undivided church, the era of the ecumenical councils, the theological focus was on Christology, with consequences, of course, to soteriology. In the 20th century, as a result of the division of Christianity and the ensuing ineffectiveness of the Christian mission, the focus inevitably shifted to ecclesiology. the most urgent demand today for the Orthodox theology and the Christian theology in general is undoubtedly of an anthropological character. Metropolitan of Dioclea Callistos insists on the importance of anthropology for the future of Christian theology and witness. Beyond the widely accepted distinction between the apostolic tradition with capital T and all the later local traditions with small t, another important distinction is equally necessary in order to articulate a Christian anthropology, especially an Orthodox anthropology, that of the authentic, although latent, tradition, and the one historically shaped as an ethos, albeit a majority in some cases, this historical tradition is. Metropolitan Callistos argued, and I quote, "Many fathers of the church believe that the divine image in the human being should be related to the power of self-knowledge and of speech. But there are others who may be a minority, but a significant minority, who adopt a more holistic approach, asserting that the divine image includes not only the soul, but the whole being, body, soul, and spirit together. It is in this way they agree with the view expressed by the Fifth Ecumenical Council and with the Christian Creed. Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, for example, wrote, "The soul and the spirit can be part of, but not the entire human being. A perfect human being is a union both of a soul who has the spirit of the Father and held in the image of God, a meaningful flesh." End of quote. According to him, the reality of the human person is beyond and above whatever explanation we choose to give it. Unlike the computer, a human being means to be unpredictable, free and creative, thus inevitably destined to embark on the scientific journey. To give an example, half a century ago, Hélène Cizus and Catherine Clement, in their book celebrated The Newly Born Women, gave the context in which the Church is called upon to give her witness on social and moral issues. They spoke about the impossible to predict what will happen with sexual variations in the future in 200 or 300 years. Men and women are involved in a web of centuries of cultural determinations that are almost impossible to analyze in their complexity. It is now impossible to talk about women or men as we know them till now. After the Second World War, the new ethical issues have arisen, forcing the Christian world, and especially their theology, mostly in an apologetic tone, ignoring most of the time the newest findings of science. Today, there is a clear distinction between what is a sin, a theological or a Christian term, and what is a crime, a secular. Adultery, for instance, is always a sin, but in most countries, it is not an offense punishable by the law. Rape, on the other hand, continues to be both a sin and a crime. In some, whereas previously the human identity was considered as something given, today it is also argued, not by all, but by a majority of scholars, that all identities are constructions formed by their environment, thus developing a new ethos. Modernity attempts to impose this kind of inclusive ethos with all kinds of understandings, while traditional societies, especially religious ones, advocate an exclusive given ethos. Now, science and Christian and Orthodox anthropology. To address this new situation, Christians and Orthodox especially appear unprepared. The following three considerations therefore seem necessary. First, a theological reconsideration of human sexuality. Second, a new dynamic and scientific interpretation of the biblical and patristic text with a new and better interpretation. And third, a prudent approach to scholarly and scientific results, especially with regard to the nature and role of women in church and society. In the ecumenical world, a letter from Sheffield was sent to all churches saying, starting the decade, Churches in Solidarity with Women, we welcome the recognition that human sexuality does not contradict the Christian spirituality, which is identified and concerns the body, the mind, and the spirit in their entirety. Unfortunately, sexuality itself has been for centuries and continues to be problematic. End of quote. In the Bible, of course, human beings are not determined by their nature, but by their relationship with God and with their fellow human beings. Therefore, their salvation is not achieved through any denial of the body, including sexuality. Moreover, the disobedience of our ancestors did not bequeath guilt to humankind and even linked to sexuality, but it was linked to morality and perishability. The physical and spiritual function of the human beings are perceived as an inseparable unity, and both can either distance them from God or put them at His service, that is, in communion with Him. The flesh is not identified with evil, nor is it extremely dangerous. It becomes so when humans exclusively base their existence on it. Unbridled and heterosexual and unnatural, not only homosexual but also heterosexual sexual activity on the one hand, but also hypocrisy on the other, are, at least for St. Paul, in dealing with this issue in the first two chapters in the book of Romans, examples are of wrong human behavior. Equally, in the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition, as a great Orthodox scholar, the late Father John Meyendorff has long ago argued, and I quote, human nature is not a static, closed, autonomous entity, but a dynamic reality. The human being is a relationship with God. End of quote. Fall, because by the grace of God it can be transformed and become again integral. Indeed, the role of God's grace is that it essentially provides human beings with their natural substance, hypostasis. The subject of human sexuality, therefore, is directly related to Christian anthropology. And the main area of controversy is the gender issue, with homosexuality and the role of women in church and society being the main anthropological components. I will not deal with homosexuality because we lost some time. With regard to women in the wider Christian circles, until very recently, those who supported the rights of women and her dignity as human persons created by God primarily relied on the famous Galatian passage, there is no longer male and female. At the other end, the various supporters, mainly from the conservative evangelical world, of the literal reading of the biblical texts without qualitative grading, limited the value of the above passage only to its narrow salvific dimension, that women can be saved as men. Therefore, they adopt other passages of the Corpus Paulinum
scholarly considered as Deutero-Pauline, as identifying the authentic Pauline view. However, neither the Galatian passage nor those of exactly the opposite view are now considered as the Pauline contribution to the nature of women and their role in society from the earliest Christian tradition, which St. Paul simply adopted as he did for the Eucharist and the Christ resurrection, because they simply stem from the later Deutero-Pauline or post-Pauline literature, not representing the authentic teaching of the historical Paul. I use this term also because we know the discussion about the historical Jesus of history. All verses except the one demanding women to be silenced in the church, according to the 1 Corinthians 14th chapter. This passage, however, in addition to being contrary to the argument of St. Paul himself in the same epistle 3 chapters earlier, according to which women are not only allowed to have a praying, a liturgical, but also a teaching presence in the liturgical synaxes of Corinth, these verses also break the flow of the argument and its literary coherence after verse 36. It is also missing or replaced in some early manuscripts. All this led biblical scholarship and science, as well as modern interpreters, to conclude that this passage is a later addition, a gloss in other ways, a term used in biblical scholarship, in the original text of the epistle. However, what radically changed the state of scholarship and the biblical research was the discovery of the significance of the last chapter of the epistle to the Romans, an epistle the most expensive in the New Testament, in which we find the fullest exposition of the Pauline gospel. In Romans 16, the first 2 chapters, Paul recommends to the Romans a woman called Phoebe from the harbor of city of Corinth, Kechre, with the addition that she is a leading figure. She was called deacon, and although at that time the deacons were not an official liturgical institution, Phoebe must have been a prominent and leading person in the Corinthian church. Moreover, the fact that Paul recommends to the recipients a woman who carries this letter probably suggests that Phoebe certainly was on a very significant mission. A little further down, Paul greets a woman and her husband, Prisca and Aquila. The important thing in this case is that the woman is mentioned prior to her husband, in contrast to the ancient practice, which may mean that Prisca was the leader of her own church at home. According to the book of Acts, the couple was expelled from Rome by Emperor Claudius and met with Paul in Corinth. There, we also read that Prisca and her husband have taught Apollos the correct faith. In any case, Paul calls them co-workers, synergos, a title that is in his original letters is given to important leaders of the church like Apollos, Titus, and Timothy. In verse 6, there is a reference to Mariam, identified by some commentators with Mary Magdalene. Of extreme importance is the verb kopian, struggling, used here and repeated twice later in this chapter also for other 3 women, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and further down, Persis. All these references indicate certainly that the female participation in the leadership, management, and ministry of the early church. But the most important reference appears in verse 7 of the 16th chapter, which refers to a woman apostle, Junia. There, Paul greets two people who were prominent, as he said, among the apostles. One was Andronicus, a male name, but the other, which also is an apostle, and even before Paul, in most of the older Western translations was attributed to a man, although Junia was quite a common female name in Roman use, never a male one. If Junia is a female, is a woman, and Junia is the right name, and in the Orthodox tradition it has always been as such, and in addition she was from the beginning venerated as a saint, and especially twice, in February 22 and in May 17. And lastly, this reading has become widely accepted in all official scientific translations. Then we have a further proof that women were apostles at an early stage in the early Christian tradition. And allow me to give you a testimony from the 6th century after Christ, from Saint Gregory, the Patriarch of Antioch, who, in praising the mere-bearing women, wrote, and I quote, "Tell my disciples," it's Jesus speaking, the resurrected Christ is speaking, "tell my disciples what mysteries you have seen. Become teachers of the teachers. Let Peter, the one who denied me, that I can," and listen to the verb, to the terms, "I can ordain also female apostles." To conclude, there is no doubt that St. Paul's view on the nature and role of women has faithfully followed the teaching and general behavior of the historical Jesus. In addition to what was described above, many other issues pertinent to Christian anthropology are being recently discussed, especially the imperative need for the admission of women into the diaconal sacramental priesthood, in other words, as liturgically ordained deaconesses. And in addition, an ecological approach can hardly be ignored. The male and female, note, not male or female, the male-female interrelatedness is also mutually related to a Christian understanding of integral ecology. There is an interesting concern in all the traditional ancient churches, the Orthodox included, especially the Catholic, where an ambivalent admixture of natural law and patriarchal ideology is evident. If man and woman complete each other in both church and society, why is patriarchal male headship still enshrined in our church's ministry, given that men and women are fully homogeneous in their whole beings? This obviously stems from a patriarchal ideology of male domination and female submission, which for many scholars was the consequence of the Augustinian doctrine of the original sin. As long as the patriarchal binary prevails in human relations, as well as in human nature relations, there can be no fully integral ecology. As long as human behaves as the dominant male and treats nature as a submissive female, there can be no lasting social justice, which will result in the destruction of our environment. It is true that the Old Testament exemplifies patriarchal bias in many ways, notably by the metaphor of the woman coming out of man from the first chapter in Genesis. It is inescapable, however, that this was corrected in the New Testament, notably by the Pauline explicit statement that when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman. God becoming incarnate from a woman is a reversal of a woman coming out of man. For the church, the rehabilitation of women to status of equality at all levels is an acute ethical issue. For extreme cases, women were never entrusted leading roles in ritual, even though in the Orthodox Church the order of deaconesses was an accepted and celebrated liturgical office. The gender ambivalence of ritual is revealed by the dichotomy between theology and practice. While the Orthodox liturgy and all Christian liturgy includes female saint veneration and reputes the Theotokos, and I quote, as more honorable than the cherubim and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, in other words, above the world of the celestial beings, down on earth women are excluded from joining the superior clergy, even to the rank of deaconesses, which is discussed in modern Orthodox biblical scholarship and general theological scholarship. The issue at stake is not the ordination of women as such, in other words, as a sociological issue of a power struggle, and some would say a demand of modernity and the scientific revolution, but the missiological, liturgical, anthropological, and ecological dimension of the diaconal understanding of the Christian priesthood. And I conclude with a few words. Orthodoxy and or the Church Universal, in order to effectively witness to the gospel in today's modern and postmodern context, in addition to reaffirming her ecclesial and not confessional or ideological identity and her authentic perception of eschatology, she desperately needs a new encounter with modernity and a new and dynamic relations with science as presented in the previous paper, especially in periods of pandemic, and a coherent anthropology quite evident in the authentic, though latent, Orthodox tradition in dealing with today's burning ethical issues such as the gender theory and the nature of women and her role in church and society. I do apologize for this interruption, of course. Back to you, Roman.
Thank you very much, Professor Vassiliadis. It's really very dense and an informative talk that gives an exposition of Orthodox approach, or with the focus on anthropology, to the array of questions that you discussed in your paper. In a way, we have a very complemented now view, Western and Eastern, on the problematic of science and religion. I have selected two questions for you from our audience. Professor Vassiliadis, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Yes. Again, thank you very much for your highly informative talk. And now we have a session of questions and answers. And I have selected two questions for you, and if you can comment on that. The first question is, how would you briefly describe similarities and differences in dealing with the problematic of science and religion from the Orthodox perspective in comparison to typical Western Catholic or Protestant approaches. Can you comment on this? I'll just briefly translate the question for the Ukrainian audience, and you have a minute to think about. Отже, питання, які є схожі і відмінні аспекти, коли йдеться про проблематику співвідношення науки і релігії з православної перспективи до типових західних підходів, чи католицьких, чи протестантських. Professor Vassiliadis, please.
I think the question is very important, and I will continue what Professor McGrath said earlier. And I will explain why I concentrated on the anthropological dimension. Last century, the world in the West especially was occupied by the so-called evolution theory, or about the famous, at the beginning of the last century, the famous trial of apes. In the Eastern Christian world, this kind of opposition between the natural science and Christian faith was not so much influential, because, as Professor McGrath said, there were many important writers, especially Saint Basil the Great, who in his explanation of the first 6 days of the Genesis, he was so open to the scientific approach, as of course St. Augustine was in the Latin tradition, the Latin Christian tradition. So this is the problem with regard to the natural science. There is a more acute problem in the West with regard to natural science faith relations, whereas in the Eastern tradition, in our Orthodox tradition, because we have not undergone, as I said, the so-called modern process, the so-called secularization, but not in the bad sense, but in the proper sense, the theology and the church are unprepared with regard to the new developments in medicine, in biology, in genetics, and also in areas like the so-called moral issues. It is not accidental that whereas the Western reaction against the so-called new tendencies, moral tendencies, were concentrated on the so-called moral issues, pro-life movements, and so on and so forth. In our church, in our Eastern tradition, especially with the initiative of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, more emphasis was given on the so-called social issues, especially the environmental issue. That's why it was considered, and also the recent Pope has followed this with the Laudato Si on the same direction. This is my view. There is no differences, but there are some more emphasis because of the so-called traditional values of its Western and Eastern Christianity. This is in brief.
Yeah, thank you. I will translate this for the Ukrainians. Отже, відповідь професора Васильядіса. Останнє століття, 20 століття, в західному контексті внесло велике замішання через обговорення процесів наукових відкриттів, пов'язаний з еволюцією, з еволюціонізмом. І чому я на тому тлі вибрав антропологічний фокус своєї доповіді? Тому що на Сході історично склалось так, що не було такої напруги між християнським світоглядом, між християнством і природничими науками. Вони якось автономно і існували, і не було такої опозиції. В додаток до того, патристична традиція, зокрема, такими особами, як Василій Великий чи Григорій Богослов, вона була відкрита до еволюціоністської інтерпретації 6 днів сотворіння чи походження Всесвіту. Так само, як згадав професор Макграф про те, що Августин і інтерпретації його відкриті до нової інтерпретації, до еволюціоністської інтерпретації походження Всесвіту. На Заході ця проблематика постала дуже гостро, бо вона була в контексті модернізму і постмодернізму. А Схід, в свою чергу, не досвідчив таких інтенсивних процесів в період модерну, як це було на Заході. Тому ця проблематика залишилася частково осторонь. Крім того, зараз дуже видно, що церква не готова православна церква не готова до багатьох цих питань, зокрема, коли йдеться про біологію, генетику і багато інших сфер природничих наук. Також викликами є моральні питання, про які я згадував в доповіді, це рух за життя і так далі. Тому православна церква сфокусувалася в більшості на питаннях, які спільні і для Заходу, зокрема, питання довкілля і питання екологічної свідомості. Так, патріарх Варфоломій зробив ці кроки, і вслід йому Папа Франциск також видав енцикліку Laudato Si, і, власне, ця сфера екології довкілля є тим, що є спільного зараз між Заходом і Сходом у цій царині. I have another question for you, Professor Vassiliadis, and it goes like this. In the light of the Pauline letters that you discussed in your talk, and in particular the stories of the prominent women leaders, how do you see personally the women's role in the Orthodox Church nowadays? Отже, питання у світлі листів Павла і, власне, історії про видатних жінок-лідерок апостольського періоду. Як професор Василіадіс бачив би роль жінок в сучасній православній церкві? Professor Vassiliadis, please.
I am now presenting the so-called results of modern biblical scholarship, but not only biblical scholarship. The biblical scholarship with regard to women's role in the early church, based mainly on the gospel narratives that exemplify an important role at the very high moment of the Son of God's earthly life, his passion and resurrection. And the evidence we have, as I said, from the Pauline epistles show that this was not something that was a peripheral issue. And in addition, modern archaeological findings have accompanied the so-called evidence we have, the liturgical text we have from the 8th century, Codex Barbarini and so on, including the role of the deaconess and the ordination in accordance with the higher priesthood, of course, with the difference between the priestly function of the presbyter and the bishop and the diaconal one. We have now findings from the early period, the 4th centuries, the first 4 centuries, with some artifacts that have shown not only in catacombs, previously only in catacombs we had, but we have also a sarcophag from the second Hagia Sophia in Constantinople before the erection by Justinian, the new big one, a sarcophag where we have women together with men in a praying position, in a orange position, as we call it in the archaeology. And these are not only isolated findings. There are plenty even in the crypt of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. Was found another discovery from ivory containing the holy relics, in which women also praise on the holy table, raising the cup. And with these findings, we are now able to explain the Saint Vitellius mosaic in Ravenna, 15th or 16th century, where on the one side we have Justinian holding with priests and the local bishop Maximianos holding the paten with the holy bread, and Theodora holding the holy chalice on exactly the same position, which means that even after the so-called I don't want to mention also that Saint Nona, the mother of Saint Gregory, died on the around the holy table, and we know this from Saint Gregory's final speech about her. So we have many not only biblical but also later discoveries and findings that give, especially in the Eastern Orthodox Christian world, this kind of women presence, at least in the diaconal. As I said, we're not talking about ordination of women, which is a power struggle, which is promoted by so-called feminists, but for a diaconal dimension of the Christian faith.
Yeah, thank you. I will resume your answer for the Ukrainians. Отже, я, відповідаючи на це запитання, хочу взяти до уваги кілька аспектів, зокрема, не лише результати біблійних досліджень, про які я згадував, але також і цілий комплекс, зокрема, біблійні розповіді про страсті і воскресіння, і те все, що я згадував в корпусі святого Павла. Все це доводить до мене на думку, що питання жіночого служіння в церкві – це далеко не периферійне питання, не другорядне питання, тому що окрім цих біблійних свідчень, ми на сьогодні маємо великий корпус артефактів, які походять з археології, зокрема Кодекс Барберіні, які нам розкривають роль дияконес і роль якби свячень жіночих в контексті ранньої церкви. Перші 4 століття свідчать про те, що жінки мали визначну роль у літургійному служінні. І на сьогодні це не лише катакомби, бо недавно ці артефакти походили з катакомб. На сьогодні ми маємо дуже цікаве свідчення з періоду другого періоду святого базиліки чи катедри Святої Софії у Царгороді, зокрема саркофаг з цього другого періоду, де ми бачимо, що і жінки, і чоловіки є в позиції літургійного моління. Також важливим свідченням є знахідка у крипті Святого Петра у Римі. Був віднайдений якби релікварій зі слонової кістки, який також демонструє літургійну роль жінок. Всі ці археологічні і біблійні свідчення разом дають нам можливість інтерпретувати дуже загадкову, але потужну мозаїку собору у Равенні, яка походить з 15 століття і зображає Теодору, яка тримає чашу на рівні і поруч з єпископом. Тому на сьогодні ми можемо говорити, що є численні свідчення біблійні, позабіблійні, археологічні, які дають нам підстави говорити про те, що жінки мали суттєву літургійну роль у ранньому християнстві. Інше питання, що сучасний феміністичний рух, який обрамлений боротьбою за владу, power struggle, це якби інша траєкторія, але коли ми розглядаємо контекст християнського свідчення, то маємо беззаперечні свідчення того, що жінки мали визначну роль у літургійному житті в ранньому християнстві.
May I add something also from the Russian and Kievan tradition?
Чи можу я додати щось до цього з перспективи слов'янської, російської і київської, української традиції?
Russian and Kievan sisterhoods and brotherhoods have developed before the so-called Soviet Revolution, and the church herself devoted in the Great Sobor in 1917 to 18 great progress towards reviving the order of deaconesses. Unfortunately, it was the revolution that has stopped this process. So we try, I mean,
на жаль,
in addition to Theodoru, also from your tradition. And also, my paper can be shared to all participants, please. The full text.
Yes. Київська традиція дореволюційна також має численні свідчення про служіння дияконес. І собор 1917-18 року православної церкви зробив великий прогрес у напрямку відновлення служіння дияконес, але був перерваний, очевидно, подіями більшовицької революції. Тому і те, що ми маємо в Равенні з Теодорою, і те, що ми маємо в контексті Київської церкви, воно суголосне. Це я хотів додати у відповідь на своє запитання. Thank you very much, Professor Vassiliadis. I think we are slightly running out of time. I would like to thank you again for your wonderful and highly informative talk. And I would like to ask Roman Solovey to say a few housekeeping remarks for the sessions that will follow this plenary session with the main speakers. Please.
Шановні колеги, ми трішки затрималися з пленарними засіданнями, але це пов'язано було з технічними труднощами. Ми маємо продовжити нашу роботу конференції вже буквально через 13 хвилин. У нас розпочнуться паралельні сесії, тому, на жаль, у нас дуже коротенька буде перерва, буквально 13 хвилин. І о 13:30 ми з вами продовжимо роботу конференції. Ми всі заходимо сюди, в нашу загальну сесійну залу, і тоді з'явиться можливість обрати одну з тих доповідей, які будуть. Я сподіваюся, що будуть усі, тому що наразі, наскільки мені відомо, є усі учасники цих сесій, і ви можете обрати одну з 5 доповідей на ваш розсуд в першій паралельній сесії, і потім одну з 5 доповідей в другій паралельній сесії. До речі, буде можливість перемикатись між доповідями, тобто якщо одна доповідь видасться вам не надто цікавою, я сподіваюся, такого не буде, але якщо ви можете без проблем перемкнутися на іншу доповідь. В кожній з паралельних сесій буде модератор, в кожного доповідача, який буде стежити за часом і допомагатиме розв'язувати технічні запитання. Я не знаю, чи вам доводилось брати участь в такому форматі. По суті, треба дивитись на це як на фізичне приміщення. Ви можете зайти в загальний зал, з нього можете зайти в якусь кімнату. Щось подібне буде і тут. Ми зайдемо в загальний зал, і потім не хост, а кожен сам обере собі, в яку кімнату йому приєднатися. Потрібно буде обрати цю за прізвищем доповідача доповідь і натиснутися «Join» або «Приєднатися», і ви опинитеся в цій кімнаті. Коли закінчиться оця перша паралельна сесія, ми повернемося всі в загальний зал і потім знову розподілимося на другу частину паралельних сесій. І після цього в нас ще заплановані 2 потужні доповіді після обіду. Тому в тих вже 11 хвилин, які залишилися, вам треба набратися енергії, чаю, кави і сил для продовження нашої конференції. Наш Zoom залишається відкритим, ви можете залишитися з кимось і спілкуватися, не потрібно виходити, щоб потім не було зайвих труднощів з приєднанням. Отже, всім приємного кавування.
Yeah, I would like to say a few words for our English-speaking participants. After the break, there will be parallel sessions, 99% in Ukrainian. Unfortunately, we are unable to provide simultaneous translation into English because it's meant for the Ukrainian scholars and participants. But as it is indicated in the program, from 3 p.m. Local time, we will still have 2 plenary sessions with the 2 keynote speakers, Professor Gabriele Gionti on the cosmology and Professor Gian Domenico Boffi on the mathematics as a bridge between science and religion. So we very much look forward to see you this afternoon. The same link and the same procedures. So have a nice break and see you soon.